Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Nils Jakob Liersch and I will present to you a paper which I have given at the Yoga Yoga Sadhana conference this year on the 28th of May 2026 in Paris. The title of the paper is the Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya, a Kashmiri yoga text on the rise of Kuṇḍalinī. So the Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya is not to be confused with Paramahamsa Purnananda's Ṣaṭcakranirūpana. The Ṣaṭcakranirūpana was the text that was edited by Sir John Woodroffe, aka Arthur Avalon, and played a crucial role in spreading the Indian chakra system, or in one of the Indian chakra systems, to Europe. So it was very dominant and really shaped our discourse. But this is another text with a very similar title. I want to discuss how this text, the Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya, might be situated within our current understanding of the historical development of yoga traditions. My work on this text is part of the ERC Advanced Grant Project Ka-Sa-Ha Rakṣa, Saving the Kashmiri Sanskrit Heritage, at the Philipps University Marburg, led by Professor Jürgen Haneda. Within this project, a broad range of previously unedited or insufficiently studied Sanskrit sources from Kashmir are currently being critically edited and studied. My own work focuses on critical editions and annotated translations of Kashmiri yoga texts. In this presentation, I will briefly introduce the Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya and highlight some of its distinctive features. I will then discuss the central paradigm of the text, before tracing the historical development of this paradigm across tantric and yogic literature. Finally, I will conclude with some reflections on what the text can tell us about the broader history of yoga. The Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya is a hitherto unedited yoga text from Kashmir. The text's terminology clearly links it to a Kaula Śaiva milieu, as we shall see. It survives in 8 currently known manuscripts, 7 in Śāradā script, as you can see here on the top right, and 1 in Devanagari script, none of which are dated, unfortunately. The text is typically transmitted within larger manuscript compilations, very often alongside other yoga texts that circulated in Kashmir, while its author remains entirely unknown. Although many of its themes overlap with later Raja and Hatha yoga traditions, neither of these categories is explicitly mentioned, nor does the text appear to be directly shaped by them. The text consists mainly of Anushtup verses interspersed with prose passages which explain esoteric terminology and referring to other shastras. Overall, the text is relatively short, comprising of only 51 shlokas and 41 prose passages. So what makes the Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya a particularly noteworthy text? The text deals exclusively with one of the most widespread verse traditions in the history of yoga. This verse transmits a specific yogic paradigm that persisted more than an entire millennium and underwent significant transformations over time. I identified more than 18 texts that transmit variants of the verse across centuries and traditions. Tracing these transformations can reveal important insights into the historical development of yoga traditions, and of course the text itself. But first, let us have a look at the paradigm found in the Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya. In the text, the verse goes as follows: Ṣatchakram Shodashadaram Trilakṣyam Vyoma Panchakam Sharire ye na jananti Nate yogyah gulagame. 6 chakras, 16 supports, 3 foci and 5 voids or spaces. Those who do not know this within the body are not suited for yoga in the Kula tradition. How is this paradigm presented in the Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya? As the slide shows here on the left top corner, the paradigm is unfolded sequentially throughout the text in a highly systematic manner. At its core, the text appears coherent and was probably originally composed primarily in verse form. However, the transmitted version also contains prose passages and a few additional verses that seem to reflect later redactional intervention. These prose sections often resemble explanatory glosses, yet some of them appear to misunderstand or partially obscure the structure of the underlying system. This is historically significant because the text may preserve an earlier and more coherent layer of the Ṣaṭcakra paradigm and was subsequently reshaped through transmission and some attempt of a commentary or even para-text that were copied and thus integrated within the text in later subsequent stages of transmission of this text. What is especially interesting here is the way the text presents the chakra system. The second verse states that in the very beginning there is Brahmabila, a chakra, or the Brahmabila chakra, contained within all living beings, and that the yoga nala, the yogic channel through which the ascent later of Shakti or Kuṇḍalinī takes place, co-arises together with the entire cosmos. This is quite remarkable because in many tantric systems the chakras are primarily visualized or ritually installed during meditation practice. Here, however, the subtle body seems to be understood not merely as a meditative construct, but as an ontological structure woven into creation itself. If you look here on the left, you can see that the chakras, the sequence of chakras, are ordered rather unusual. The text lists the Brahmabila chakra, the navel chakra, the heart chakra, the throat chakra, but then the Bindu and the Talu chakras, which is striking because this upper sequence of the sixfold system appears reversed. The Talu chakra at the palate comes after the Bindu chakra between the eyebrows, breaking the vertical ascent. This inverted order is extremely rare and, to my knowledge, otherwise only attested in ninefold chakra systems of early modern texts, such as the Yoga Svarodaya and the Tattva Yoga Bindu, both probably dating to around the 16th century, and both also preserving variants of the same paradigm. Looking at the description of Kuṇḍalinī in the Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya, in many ways reveals a concept of Kuṇḍalinī remarkably close to later standardized Kuṇḍalinī models. We encounter, as you can see here on the slide, highlighted in bold type, many familiar motifs: the dormant serpent power, the triple coil, the distinction between dormant and awakened states, and the upward movement of Shakti through the body. The awakening through Sankochana, a form of contraction, also anticipates later Hatha yogic techniques involving bandhas and mudras. At the same time, however, the passage still preserves a distinctly tantric conceptual background. Particularly noteworthy is the identification of Kuṇḍalinī with a matrix of phonemes from A to Ksha. This connects her directly to Śaiva theories of sound and Matrika cosmology and gives the passage a much stronger Kashmiri tantric character than a merely proto-Hatha yogic one. Equally interesting is the idea that Shakti, as you can see here, moves in two directions, ascending and descending, which suggests a more dynamic circulation of energy rather than the later, often linearized model of a purely ascending Kuṇḍalinī. Finally, at the very end, on the right side, in the Sanskrit, we see the designation Kuṇḍalinī, the fire stick of the Kula, which gives the passage a very specific Kaula tantric coloring. Overall, the passage appears transitional, already very close to classical Kuṇḍalinī yoga, yet still deeply embedded in earlier Śaiva tantric thought. After the rather extensive discussion of the 6 chakras, which lasts the first 28 verses, the text turns to the 16 ādhāras, or supports. These seem to represent a more refined and detailed mapping of the very same yogic process, namely the visualization and upward ascent of Shakti or Kuṇḍalinī through the body. As you can see here in this list, the terminology of the system appears very transitional, preserving older tantric concepts like guhana, sarvadara, or 5, birth, and so on and so forth, but also terminology that appears in later early modern texts. The 3 lakṣyas described in the next verses represent 3 modes of yogic perception or concentration. The text distinguishes an externally directed focus, which eventually turns into an internal focus, and finally a supreme middling focus, which causes the supreme state of the system. What is particularly striking, however, is that the text never clearly explains how these lakṣyas exactly relate to the previously described Cakras and ādhāras. But it seems clear to me that they form part of the same yogic process, were complementary, so to speak, which you can see the same yogic process is also picked up in the following. The final part of the paradigm, and also the text as a whole, is the presentation of the system of the 5 vyomans, or subtle spaces, as you can see here in the table. Here the ascent of Shakti or Kuṇḍalinī is mapped onto progressively more refined states of consciousness, from the waking state associated with the earth element up to the transcendent state of Sadashiva beyond the 4th state, associated with space or void itself. The system therefore presents a strongly verticalized Śaiva model of consciousness. The concluding verse you can see here on the bottom then describes Shakti, appearing in the form of a thread, ascending through the Kalagni chakra, piercing the Brahma-bila, and rising beyond the body altogether. The term Kalagni chakra is particularly interesting because it seems to preserve a very archaic Śaiva tantric layer. The term appears, and this is one of the very few references that exist at all to the term, in Vijnana Bhairava Tantra 52, in which a related visualization practice describes the yogin imagining the body being consumed by fire, issuing from the right big toe of Bhairava. This imagery is especially suggestive because the rise of Shakti, Prana, or Kuṇḍalinī through the system of the 16 ādhāras in most texts that contain this very same paradigm our Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya is based on begins almost always at the lower extremities of the body. Now let us turn to the transmission history of the paradigm. As mentioned earlier, the verse can be traced across more than a millennium of tantric and yogic literature, as you can see here, where listed chronologically all the texts in which this paradigm in a very, very similar verse appears. One of its earliest attestations is found in the Netratantra. The paradigm even leaves traces in the Hatha Pradipika, the famous classical, the locus classicus of Hatha Yoga. Although the verse itself is absent, its components are nevertheless discussed extensively in the Shiva Yoga Pradipika. As you can see, the system could therefore circulate both as a compact formula and as a more elaborate doctrinal structure. Interestingly, James Melanson suggested to me that the original Viveka Martanda did not contain the verse at all, and that it entered the textual tradition only around the 16th century, by when the text was already going under the wrong name Goraksha Shataka, historical confusion. And this means that there's basically no early Hatha Yoga source that contains the text, leaving an extended historical gap between the earlier Śaiva Kaula sources, the isolated appearance in the Hatha Pradipika, and the later, if you want, explosion of the paradigm in early modern yoga texts. Because from around the 16th century onward, the paradigm becomes increasingly widespread. It reappears in texts such as the Yoga Svarodaya, the Siddha Siddhanta Padati, the Tattva Yoga Bindu, and even in the Yoga Upanishads. What we see is not a linear transmission, but a long history of adaptation, an originally Śaiva Kaula paradigm repeatedly taken up and reshaped within Hatha Yoga, Rajayoga, and early modern yoga texts. It constitutes a closely interwoven, intertextual network. What we see here is a remarkably dense and interconnected transmission history. Kuṇḍalinī appears in almost all texts transmitting the verse. A major exception is the Mantana Bhairava Tantra, where the ascending principle is instead described as Rudra Shakti. This suggests that the later dominance of the term Kuṇḍalinī was not yet fully fixed. In the Netratantra, Kuṇḍalinī is only mentioned very briefly, and it remains unclear whether she is conceived as a blockage to be overcome, as suggested by James Mallinson, or whether the passage instead describes the ascending Shakti as being obstructed by the grantis, knots, which is the current suggestion in the working edition of the critical edition currently being prepared by Flood, Wernicke Olesen, and Kativoda. Abhinavagupta presents the paradigm in his Tantra Loka within the context of Utkranti. The Nirutteravada presents the paradigm's verse and instructs the practitioner to transcend it. Even the Hatha Pradipika seems unable to exclude the paradigm entirely. The verse is found as the first of the four called Saubhadra verses, which appear in its fourth chapter in a structurally isolated and I would say almost intrusive form. Later recensions reduce these four verses into a single Kuṇḍalinī verse. Yet, in our critical edition of the Hatha Pradipika, we had to retain the passage because it is already attested in the Alpha recension. That means either that the paradigm was so widespread and so well known that Svatmarama had to include it and not even had to explain it. Yeah? Calling the 6 chakras and the 16 ādhāras without seeing the need of explaining them to the readership. Or it is a later interpolation, which must therefore, having entered the textual tradition at a very, very early stage, be it as it may. Finally, in the early modern yoga texts, the paradigm undergoes remarkable expansion. The verse appears, as we've already seen, with increasing frequency, especially in the works characterized by highly elaborate yoga taxonomies, which teach up to 15 different types of yoga. A particularly important development is that the lakṣyas detach from their original context and form an independent yogic method, which is usually explained as very simple: lakṣya yoga. In this process, also the number of the lakṣyas increases from 3 to 5. Actually, whenever the lakṣyas are presented as a set of 5, it is usually only in the context, it is only in the context of a description of lakṣya yoga. At the same time, the ādhāras become increasingly corporealized. Earlier tantric models mainly describe the ascent of Shakti or Kuṇḍalinī, but early modern systems connect concrete practices to the single ādhāras, be it asanas, be it mudras, bandhas, kumbhakas, also visualizations and mantras. They are all mapped onto the 16 specific bodily supports. As we can see, the model thus develops from a compact Śaiva contemplative scheme into a broader framework for integrating many forms of yogic practice. Now I want you to look at this comparative table, which immediately reveals the remarkable stability of the paradigm, here highlighted in different colors. And I've ordered this table from the earliest sources to the more recent one, as good as I am currently able. So the core structure remains, as you can see, strikingly consistent. 6, sometimes 9 chakras. 16, occasionally 6 supports. 2, sometimes 3 lakṣyas. And basically almost always 5 vyomans or kas. So despite these little variations, the paradigm itself remains surprisingly stable over time. What changes much more significantly, what you can see here, is the second half of the verse. What I've marked here in blue as the competence section. In the earlier Śaiva tantric sources, still here printed in black, the paradigm is embedded within broader ritual and contemplative contexts. But in the later yoga texts, the concluding half verse increasingly shifts toward defining yogic legitimacy itself. A true yogi is the one who knows the system within his body, his or her body. And this is, as you can see here, highlighted in bold blue type, where the Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya may become historically important. My growing impression is that the text preserves an intermediate stage in exactly this transformation, the moment when an originally Śaiva, Kaula, contemplative schema begins to be reformulated into a portable marker of yogic identity and competence. If so, the Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya may occupy precisely the missing position between the early Śaiva tantric sources and the later early modern yoga tradition of the verse. I think the Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya is the only text which is really capable of filling the gap that has now emerged. I hesitate to say it to be, or to categorize it as a early Hatha yoga text, but I think it is a very important transitional Kaula yogic source which transmits the early and medieval tantric versions of the paradigm into the classical Hatha yoga and early modern yoga sources. I wouldn't claim that all those texts that come after the Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya really base this verse on the version found in the Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya, but still comparing the terminology and really seeing how this paradigm moves from the early sources to the early modern sources. It's the only way where it really fits, I think. Thus, let me conclude. The Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya, I would suggest, preserves a crucial transitional stage in the history of the Ṣaṭcakra paradigm. It stands between the earlier Śaiva Kaula formulations and the later more standardized systems of Haṭha and Rājayoga. What makes this text so important is that it does not simply transmit an isolated body map. It gives us access to one of the major transmission networks through which Kuṇḍalinī-related models of practice moved across tantric, medieval, and early modern traditions. The formula itself, Ṣaṭcakram, Śāradā, Trilakṣyam, Vyoma Panchakam, may have been so successful precisely It is compact, rhythmic, modular, and easy to remember. It condenses a complex Śaiva contemplative system into a portable yogic schema. In this sense, the Ṣaṭcakranirṇaya allows us to watch a larger historical transformation in motion, the movement from sophisticated Śaiva metaphysics toward increasingly practice-oriented yogic systems, in which subtle body knowledge becomes a marker of yogic competence. That, I think, is why this small and previously unedited text matters for the broader history of yoga. Thank you very much for listening to this paper. I would be happy if you could share your thoughts down below in the comment section. If you want to support this channel, of course, please hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you very much, and bye.